Forrest Griffin is wildin'. Forrest Griffin is wildin'. Did you happen to see that clip?
I did watch it. And it's funny because it's been almost a week, right? And it
It's
just
been
kind
about
of
a week.
it's getting into like that rotation of like, people are now throwing their opinion because I think
Might have
Guru
dropped
just
on like Friday or Thursday.
yeah, and I think Guru dropped his reaction like a few days ago. So it's interesting now it's jumping into the news cycle.
Yeah, I watched that. I actually watched the Griffin podcast, and then I watched Guru's reaction to it. I'll admit I was kind of multitasking when I watched that Griffin podcast.
It was in a background kind of.
Background thing, like I was making like my meal prep.
Gotcha.
And so when I heard him kind of kick it off like that, in my mind I was like, that's kind of wild, But I wasn't like staring at them intently, so I just kind of like moved past it. They seemed to like not really be too bothered by it.
Right. And then it started catching stream after they dropped it.
Yeah, it started catching some steam, especially with that Guru video. And I mean, I can't really speak on it being like thinking Forrest is racist, but I can speak from my experience. Like, if I'm ever like around a black guy, that's the last thing on my fucking mind, bro. Okay, just to give it a preface, Forrest was like, let's kick off this podcast so we can get on the same page. And he's saying weird shit like I as a pasty white guy, like not just a white guy, but like he's like offending himself. It was like real weird like kinky shit. You know what I mean? Like he's trying to shame himself or something like that. They used to say it about who am I talking about? There's somebody out there who they talk about who like takes pleasure in like self-deprecating themselves, if that makes sense. Sean Strickland. They say this about Sean Strickland. Like he has a kink about like publicly embarrassing himself. And like he's been asked about it a few times. I think Ariel's asked him about it. And this is like what Forrest did. He publicly embarrassed himself like by doing some weird shit, saying like I said, pasty white guys have basically done horrible shit to black people for hundreds and thousands of years through slavery. And Rampage, did you watch it by chance?
I did.
Rampage's face
I
during
watched that
it,
first like 10 minutes, yeah.
Rampage's face was like, oh god, here we go again.
Bear's too. Like Bear was all like, you could see him about to jump in. He's like, all right, hold on, we'll let you go.
Yeah. So I mean, my take on it, I guess you could say, I think Forrest was pretty uncomfortable. And that just kind of like his true colors showed there. If I'm being dead honest. Something happened there. He had like a malfunction.
It's crazy because I had a different take of it. I saw something completely different where Forrest is the question that I saw a lot of people bring up online is why did Forrest even bring it up? Like why did Forrest feel the need to even say all of that, right? To start off the podcast.
I feel like it comes from an uncomfortability standpoint.
But I think, and he said this, and I wrote this down. He goes, I want to give you a thought experiment. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like Forrest Griffin, if you were to look at even himself in other interviews, he's very, well, I want to say intellectual. Like he has a higher IQ, and I think he wanted to showcase like that he could think outside the box and share why he thinks racism is where it's at. But it was almost like it was unnecessary though. Like he didn't need to have a thought experiment with the Jaxxon podcast.
Yeah.
With Rampage. So it did kind of come off awkward where it's like, all right, cool. Good to know, bro.
I feel like that.
So that was kind of my take on it. But do you get that? Like he's like he thinks at a higher level almost.
All right, let me give you a comparison because when I was listening to this thing play out a little bit, I did have a little bit of a parallel to draw. In my interview with Joaquin, we talked a lot about race, especially because it was fitting. It was February 1st when we did the interview, Black History Month. Mm-hmm. So a few topics, he brought up race. And in my mind, while I've been like rolling out the clips and shit like that, it's been getting a lot of feedback, right? And one of the biggest feedbacks we got on one of the clips was the one where he said he wants to be one of the first black fighters to bring over the black fan base. You know what I mean? Because there's been DC, there's been John Jones, but they don't have a black fan base necessarily. You know, they're just like, they have the UFC fan base. Joaquin wants to get a black fan base over to the UFC. And in my mind, I've been thinking, these are good conversations to have, even though it makes people uncomfortable and there's people arguing in the comments. The fact that we could have that conversation, you know, and I could also hear him out. I'm not like a black guy, you know, so when he's telling me this shit and I'm understanding where he's coming from completely, I think it's a good conversation to have, especially with the contrast too, like him being black, me being a part of, I guess you could call it the demographic of the UFC, right? And so when you have the demographic now coming after Joaquin, you have me in the interview kind of like seeing, you know, being on, understanding where he's coming from. And with that being said, I think these conversations are good to have. But Forrest, the way he went about that whole thing, I feel like it wasn't really, it didn't really bring forward any like real good discussions.
You know what? Here's the thing. Let's say this. If this was a podcast about racial divide in the United States, perfect time to bring it up. Perfect podcast to bring it up on.
Mm-hmm.
You're going on a podcast that are as a UFC fighter that likes to have fun, that likes to tell stories about like when they went to war. You know what I mean? That's what that podcast was kind of built on. So it was like, know your audience. Know who you're going after almost. That's what I thought too. I was like, it just it was unnecessary. But what, you know what's crazy and what I wrote down too? Do I agree with his sentiment? 100% I agree with his sentiment. What he's saying is very truthful behind the scenes, like what's gone on in our country and the underlying tone of where racism and how people look at each other. I thought it was super spot on. I wish more white people said shit like that because they don't want to admit it, you know. And he said something too, was like, hey, you know, if a black guy were to go for a job and a white guy were to job, who do you think's gonna hire? They're gonna more likely hire the white guy.
Except Rampage didn't go along with it. Rampage was like, I think they'd hire the black guy.
And, you know, but Rampage, you don't know when he's kidding, but I like what Rampage said before, too, about racism. He's like, dude, I was growing up in the South. Like, I've been called every fucking name in there. I know exactly what it means. I've been through it. I lived through it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it just, like I said, I think that he wanted to, for whatever reason, show off his higher like intelligence regarding this discussion and say, hey, you know, I understand what black people go through. Like, I empathize for you. But I don't know, it just seemed real like awkward, unnecessary, not a good timing.
I think
if the conversation, let's say the conversation rolled there, right? And they started talking and they all of a sudden they start talking about Bryce Mitchell and other thing, and then it went into that, I could totally understand the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a hard angle when you as the white guy are going to come in and just kind of tell Rampage how you're aware, how like his people have kind of like done him wrong over the years.
Have oppressed, yeah.
It's like, I think Rampage knows, I think you know, I think it doesn't really need to be said. I mean, maybe if there was a topic, kind of like to what you're saying, maybe if there was a topic about racism, like let's say it was around the time of the whole George Floyd thing or something like that, right? Then it's like, okay, let's have this conversation. But, you know, the conversations are good to be had. Did you watch the AB and Theo Vaughn podcast by chance?
I don't think so.
Did you hear anything about it?
Antonio Brown?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so I watched it.
Who he is, though, right?
Yeah, I watched it. And if you know anything about Antonio, especially as of late, loves talking about race. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, you know, sometimes the conversation is uncomfortable, but I'm all for, you know, I guess you could say, like I said, conversations worth being had, like uncomfortability of like the N-word and things like this. You know, he was talking about that with Theo. And I think those conversations are good to be had, but they got to be like, I think brought up. I think, in my opinion, a little bit, it's better if like the black guy brings it up versus the white guy. And number two, I feel like if you do talk about this stuff, you can't have it be like a 3-minute thought experiment. You got to be like, as long as it takes. It has to be a real topic. And I think that was one thing where Forrest messed up. He tried to have it be like a quick 3-minute conversation when you can't really do that. I feel like it's got to be a longer one than that.
And I felt like it was almost like it's almost like, hey, I want you to know that I know that your people have suffered.
From my people.
Yeah, from my people. So I understand. You know, like it's almost like, but it was like so unnecessary where it was like, okay, like good to know. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, because there were weird things like in between it a little bit. Like, let me give you an example, because I mentioned the pasty white guy thing. He had said like pasty white guy, right? Pasty white guys like myself did horrible things to people like you for thousands of years. And then Rampage was like, what do you mean, like pasty white or something like that? He's like, yeah, like pasty white. Like, I'm not white. I'm like extra white. I'm like pale. And then Rampage is like, oh yeah, like pale like a pussy. And like, I'm like, dude, like this is like, this is where we're getting like, this is getting into like some weird shit. Like now Rampage is saying your skin color looks like a pussy. Right.
And that's Rampage, though. Rampage always wants to, like, push the envelope and be funny about something,
So yeah, so I didn't take it too seriously, but at the same time, now you're going to come in there, like, in this serious topic. It was just a really weird setting all around. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, the fact that Rampage said that, and then, like, when he tried to toss up Rampage that softball, Rampage, like, completely went the opposite way with it. It was just a really awkward conversation.
I'll tell you a funny story. This one girl one time, and she was here, like, and I'm just so everybody knows, we're recording in Barrio Logan, right down the street from Chicano Park, old school, like Mexican neighborhood in Southern California and San Diego. TJ's fucking 10 minutes away. Mexico's right there, right? So, Hispanic community. And one time this girl, and I had invited her, we had this little function, bro. All fucking Mexicans, bro. All Chicanos.
Yeah.
And she's all like, yeah, I moved down here because I want to understand what you people go through. Everybody just like looked at her, and they're looking at me like, bro, you invited this bitch? And you like, you invited this bitch? And we were like, dog, I don't know where that came from, bro.
Yeah.
But she's thinking in her mind, like, oh, hey, I'm part of you guys. Like I moved down here just to see what you guys are going through. And we're like, out of pocket.
It's definitely an interesting
she had a thought experiment. She wanted to live in the hood to see what we go through.
And I might think that she was probably like naive. So maybe Forrest was naive. You never know. You know?
And I think there's another, because it was innocent. Yeah. It wasn't like out of anger.
It was innocent, but yeah, it's just, like I say, it was really weird, especially when Rampage said that part about like pink like a pussy. Yeah. I was like, oh my god, like this is just getting like super uncomfortable, bro. Super fucking uncomfortable.
That's why I like Rampage though.
Yeah, Rampage is chill.